Welcome back, Nerglings. Today we are returning to our good friend Warhammer Fantasy Battle, this time with a focus on the basic game. But before we start, be sure to like, share and subscribe so you don't miss an update. If you fancy switching on notifications too, that would be spiffing. The basic game. Alright, here we go. Warhammer can become very complex, involving large numbers of rules to cover special and detailed cases. Fortunately, you don't need to learn them all, as they are handily all included in this single mighty tome, for when it comes down to it, all you have to do is move your troops and roll lots of dice. It's only when special troops are used, or when such pesky things like terrain gets in the way, that it begins to get tricky. So, let's introduce the basic ideas of the game and build upon them as we go. The Game's Master. Although it is possible to fight a game without a GM, it will be much quicker and far easier to fight with an impartial judge to aid the resolution of tricky situations. I guess this comes from the requirement for a GM in Dungeons and Dragons, something that was soon to be done away with in later iterations of the game. As the basic principles became more solidly defined, areas for exploitation were closed off and the playstyle transitioned to a more one-on-one affair. Anyway, the GM determines random directions and movement for certain monsters and units as appropriate, keeps track of the turns, ensures any compulsory movement is conducted accordingly, and any tests that must be taken are promptly resolved. It is worth noting that the best GMs are deadly serious and extremely pedantic, to provide you with the most rigidly adhered to rules as possible. No one wants a softly touch from the GM. You want cold hard facts, an icy demeanour, and if possible no small amount of martial arts training to keep those unruly players in check. Preparing for battle. Before you fight your first Warhammer game, the GM and players should familiarise themselves with the basic rules, without which the game could not proceed. Ideally, it is best for both players to have at least a reasonable grasp of the rules and an understanding of the special rules appropriate for their army, save for those new to the game. Competitive games and friendly games. Now, I'm no tournament player, but all games should be played under strictly competitive rules. None of this house rule malarkey here, no sir. Tournament style or nothing is the only way to go. Dice and other equipment. Players should ensure they are adequately prepared for the game. There is nothing so frustrating as turning up to your battle only to discover all the dice and the tape measure have been left at home. If you know you will be the GM, you will of course have been preparing for this game for most of your life up to this point. As such, it is completely unacceptable for the GM to not have at least a spare set of just about everything that is necessary to play a successful game of a Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Dice of the appropriate denominations that could and almost certainly will be used are D3, D4, D6, D8, 10, 12 and possibly D20 too. Preparations. The advanced rules explain how scenery is prepared and forces arranged for competition battles. During friendly games, if you are so inclined, players are free to place forces and scenery in any way agreed upon prior to the start of the game. Often the GM will set up the battlefield, especially if the players are playing a narrative game, something we will get into later. Defining the troops. In the Warhammer game, every creature has characteristics. Now, if you're an old salt like me, you will already know what all the little letters above stat lines mean. But for those of you who are new and or play some esoteric nonsense like Age of Sigmar, they mean the following. M. Movement allowance in inches. WS, or weapon skill in combat. BS, ballistic skill for ranged attacks. S. Strength used versus toughness. T. Toughness used versus strength. W. Wounds, or how durable a creature or gentleman is. I. Initiative, otherwise known as speed. A. Attacks is self-explanatory. LD. Leadership, or the ability to conduct various actions under duress. INT. Intelligence, used to understand situations, streamlined by merging with initiative in later versions. CL. Cool, or ability to withstand adverse psychology, streamlined by merging with leadership in later versions. And WP. Willpower, or ability to withstand magical forces, streamlined by merging with leadership in later versions, but also made more explicit in even later versions with various levels of magical resistance. The characteristic profile. A creature's characteristics can be given all at once in what is called a profile. A creature's profile give the typical characteristics for a member of that race. There are outliers in both strength, resilience and intelligence in any race, but for the most part an average is most useful. Individual models that are fielded separately represent heroes, wizards and other brave individuals of note. Weapons and armour. In addition to their profile, troops are defined by their equipment, i.e. weapons and armour, and indeed these will make or break a unit when hostilities are joined. A set of heavier armour, the addition of a shield and a better weapon will allow your typical human to become a member of a mighty band of questing knights, on foot for instance, whilst banner bearers and musicians are simply troops with equipment too. This is covered in a later section. The turn. Battles are fought between two opposing sides, pitting the wits of their commanders against each other in a duel of cunning ploys, foolhardy gambits, and no small amount of luck. To simulate this mighty conflagration of man and beast, we use the noble turn, or short amount of time in which orders are issued, movement is conducted, missiles fired, swords unsheathed, reserves called up, magic unleashed, and desperate rallying cries called. Keeping track. It is the GM's responsibility to keep track of the turn sequence. As each turn begins anew, the GM should say something grand to denote the passing of time, such as, "To the ground the dead did go, as the black arrows of the orc archers blotted out the sun. Flames licked the hooves of the braying steeds as the knights readied their charge. Will the Empire player please ready themselves for turn 2? Furthermore, as each phase progresses, the GM should call it out, and the game will move on. To make it easier to keep track of the turn sequence, the GM should use a notepad to record game turns, phases and outcomes, especially if there are particularly unlikely or noteworthy occurrences that may be the hallmarks of a truly legendary battle. For instance, the survival of a brave band of dwarfs under attack by a veritable horde of orcs and goblins. The scattering of a holy hand grenade back into the vicinity of the thrower, and the devastation of one's own unit when a rebel fanatic comes careering through their ranks. Measuring. During the game, players will need to measure move distances, ranges for missile fire, and for the use of war engines. As is usual, players must announce what they intend to do before measuring the distance, for if they cannot reach their intended target, their action is simply wasted. Similarly, If a player wishes to avoid approaching an enemy's charge range and move around them, they must estimate the distance. They may not measure it. It is a matter of bad sportsmanship indeed to be measuring distances like a noob. The most important rule. The first rule of Warhammer is don't talk about Warhammer, with girls at school, because that won't get you anywhere. Almost as important, the second rule of Warhammer is the GM is always right. Now, if you combine these two rules and simply view your girlfriend or wife as the GM, you will probably make a pretty good partner. Anyway, whatever decision the GM makes, it need not set a precedent, as different situations call for nuance and the application of common sense, and as such, what worked before may not be appropriate in the current situation. I guess this equally applies to managing your girlfriend or wife. So, there you go. You didn't know you would get sound relationship advice from a Warhammer video, did you? Movement. Okay, now we're getting to the nitty-gritty. How we move our troops around the battlefield. Movement rates are populated in the handy table, although I'm not entirely sure why a comprehensive list of movement rates is required here. I guess it takes up a bit of space. The effects of encumbrance. Interestingly, and probably unbeknownst to many, units used to be encumbered by the bulk of their equipment. This is something handily omitted from more modern versions of the game, because let's face it, this isn't a role-playing game, goddammit, this is war. Regardless, we have some tables detailing how much movement is lost for carrying various amounts of weaponry and armour. The effects of terrain. So too is movement affected by annoyances like terrain getting in the way of your sweeping advances. This is broken down into difficult ground, very difficult ground, and linear obstacles, i.e. moving through at half rate, a quarter rate, or a half rate of movement respectively. We also go through the complexities of combining different types of terrain and how it thus reduces movement even further. Organising your units. Troops on the battlefield don't just wander around aimlessly, they move with definite purpose. Well, most of them do. As part of proper military formations. Even the lowest of barbarians or meanest of orcs will group together with comrades in arms to form units. Typically, a unit consists of a number of models broadly armed and armoured the same, as to streamline the management of them in combat. Understandably, they will each be wearing different pieces of armour and carrying slightly different weapons, but we must simplify the process of dealing with them, and thus generalising them and grouping them by type is best. Composition of units. A unit must comprise of at least 5 models, including a leader and any standard bearer and or musician models. Casualties may reduce a unit to below 5 during the battle, but all units must commence the game with a minimum of 5. There is no maximum unit size, except for the limit of your patience in painting extremely large units. Many of the unit entries in Warhammer armies, for instance, will note maximum unit size, but this is to be explained in the corresponding video sometime in the future. If the models in your unit are armoured and armed slightly differently, then this can be ignored within the rules, and you may select an appropriate rule to govern them all. For instance, if half the unit has armour and the other half has shields but no armour, then it will be appropriate to give the unit a corresponding armour save that averages out the difference. If some are wearing light armour and the others hold shields, then a reasonable armour save of 6+ would suffice. Leaders. Every unit must begin the game with a leader model, distinguishable from the other models forming the unit. This model can be painted differently or armed and armoured somewhat exotically, as befits their rank and status. Leaders are generally the same race as the unit they join, and act as the focal point for the unit, issue commands and lead them on manoeuvres. The battle sheet. Alright, now we have our trusty unit, we need to detail their statistics on the battle sheet. A battle sheet is a quick reference for use during the game, to avoid the need to be constantly flicking through the army list to find stats for use during combat. Unit formation. Formations are described in terms of ranks and files. Ranks describe the lines forming the breadth of the unit, and file describes the depth of the unit. As such, a unit will be formed into rank and file. Military formations enable troops to move quickly and to adopt a suitable fighting position for attack and defense. Even ragtag barbarian types tend to become regularized as the individuals pack closely together for shelter or support. There are benefits of changing the formation of a unit during the game, and particularly deep ranks will benefit from a steamroller type effect and be able to push through other weaker units, taking advantage from the sheer mass behind them, whilst wider frontages with fewer ranks can allow archers to utilize more individual bows during ranged combat. It is up to you as to what formation is best or allowed within the confines of the terrain. Positioning leaders. Unit leaders should always be placed in the centre of the front rank, from where they can control their troops. If ranks are equal, then either of the centre two positions is fine. All changes to unit frontage are based around the leader model, the model remaining still while the troops move around it are rearranged. Special formations. Many of you are probably thinking that our definitions of formations are rather limited. Where, for example, is the square of Napoleonic times, the famous hedgehog used by pikemen, wedge employed by noble knights and brave archers, plus the polygonal formations used by some nomadic tribes, and so on. While occasionally important, these formations are not generally used in the game, although they are covered in more detail in the Advanced Rules section. Moving over difficult ground and crossing obstacles. A formation arranged in several ranks will often find some of its members faced with difficult ground, while others are not. When this happens, the whole unit is reduced to the pace of the slowest model. The necessity for this is to maintain formation. Note, units may not change formation when a member is standing on difficult ground. Single file formations. A unit in single file is arranged in a long line with one model in front of another. Special rules apply to formations of this kind, reflecting the ability of units to assume special formations such as S-shapes and even complete circles. To allow this flexibility, it is not expected that models be placed directly in front or behind each other, so long as a part of each base is in contact. This formation is best used for fast-moving cavalry transiting through narrow gorges, valleys, or between tree lines. The interpenetration of units. Two friendly units may not move through each other. Although this did happen historically, it did not happen regularly, nor without considerable precision and command being exerted. The possibility of units moving through other units is thus described later in the Advanced Rules. Proximity to enemy units. The turn sequence used in Warhammer is alternate. This means that one side moves its units while the other remains stationary. However, we must remember that this is purely a game's convention, a convenient way in which we represent the movement of troops, exchange of missiles, and the clash of close combat. Because one side moves whilst the other is immobile, it would seem that a unit could move right up to their enemy, tweak his nose and spit upon his boots, without them being able to do anything about it. Of course, we know this isn't the case. All troops of both sides would be moving all the time throughout. To reflect the fact that troops would be able to move and respond to the actions of their enemy, we shall invent a special rule. This is a very important rule, as the examples below demonstrate. When troops move, they may not approach closer than 1 inch to an enemy unit or single enemy model, unless they intend to enter hand-to-hand combat. This applies not only at the end of movement, but all the way through. So it's not possible for a model to squeeze between two closely spaced units. Manoeuvres. When a unit wishes to change its formation or the direction in which it is facing, it must make a manoeuvre. Similarly, when a unit wishes to move in some unusual manner, such as backwards, an appropriate manoeuvre to be made, I might add. There are 2 different types of manoeuvres, simple and complex. A unit's ability to manoeuvre depends upon the training and discipline of its constituent troops. Training and discipline vary. Some units and some races are naturally better at this than others, for instance. Simple manoeuvres. Simple entail formation changes, a turn of 90 or 180 degrees, or a wheel. Any unit may make one simple manoeuvre during its movement and or reserve phase, in providing the unit is not crossing an obstacle or split by an obstacle. The unit is not engaged in hand-to-hand combat. We then go on to cover the intricacies of movement in all its basic forms: first, second, third manoeuvres, formation changes, turning, wheeling, and the like. Complex manoeuvres. Complex include moving backwards, wheeling and wheeling from the centre. A complex manoeuvre requires considerable precision training and cooperation. No unit without a leader may attempt a complex manoeuvre. A complex manoeuvre is the equivalent of 3 simple manoeuvres. Gosh, I never thought I'd learn how to spell manoeuvre, but here we are. Single file formations. The noble single file formation is up next in all its lofty intricacy, and includes things like curving paths and snaking through terrain. Shooting. Battles can be won or lost by the use or misuse of troops armed with bows, crossbows, slings, javelins, and other weapons designed to be thrown or fired. Even fully armoured knights are vulnerable to the deadly shaft of the long bow, or the sure flight of the crossbow's quarrel. Many of the creatures of the Warhammer world are relatively poor fighters once engaged in hand-to-hand combat, but are fully capable of using missile weapons. Creatures such as goblins, for example, must be forced into the bloodletting carnage of close combat, and are often more useful when equipped with bows and arrows. Whatever the weapon or creature using it, missile fire is an important aspect of warfare. This chapter discusses the role of missile-armed troops and provides rules for their use on the tabletop. Ranges. The first thing to consider are the weapons themselves, their relative ranges and penetrating power, and the ease with which they can be reloaded or moved. The Warhammer world is home to a civilization not unlike that of medieval Europe. Thus, the weapons available to its inhabitants are of similar ilk. Of course, not all the weapons available to the fantastical denizens of the world have a historical counterpart. However, to begin with, we will deal with those weapons whose range and effect can be deduced from historical prototypes. Taking the bow, for instance, accepted maximum range for this weapon lies between 200 to 300 yards, something not to be sniffed at even with today's modern weapons. Some bows are longer for added reach into the enemy's lines, whilst others are shorter and more attuned to quick, reliable lobs at closer ranges. The following table shows a few example maximum ranges in yards and the associated distances on the tabletop. And let's not get hung up on the technicalities of ranges though, as we can quickly start poking holes in the logic of the chosen distances. Now, sod it. Oh, go on then. If a typical fighting man in a fantasy setting is about 5 to 6 foot tall, and he is represented by a miniature of 25mm tall, or an inch, then how do 160 yards translate to 16 inches? Surely 16 inches would equate to between 80 to 96 yards. Never mind. Hitting the targets. Regardless of how we got there, we now have our ranges. What we must do now is hit the target. Now, those of you familiar with the marvellously elegant design of the Warhammer ballistic skill system will know exactly what we are talking about here. Being as well designed as it has changed very little from edition to edition, remaining more or less the same in principle for decades. Essentially, it is worked out by taking your ballistic skill away from the number 7. So a chap with a reasonable ballistic skill of 3 will be rolling 4s to hit his intended target. That's a 50% chance to hit, not too shabby for being an untrained, flea-bitten peasant. But then how much better is an elf in this regard? A typical elf could have a ballistic skill of 4, meaning he only needs a 3 to hit. We have upped our chances to hit to 66%. Marvellous stuff. Firing arcs. Anyway, enough of all that mathematical mumbo-jumbo. Next we have firing arcs, or the arcs within the front 90 degrees of the miniature. Typically this is represented by drawing lines from the centre of the miniature's base out to the corners. The triangle formed towards his front is his firing arc. Firing through gaps. There is no rule that says a model must fire at an enemy unit, which is closer than another, although it might seem sensible to restrict a unit's choice of targets in some way. Any attempt to write rules for this invariably get bogged down in a whole list of ifs and buts. Players therefore are allowed to freely select their targets, although cannot be expected to fire at something behind a selection of targets advancing upon their position. To streamline this rule, missile troops may only fire between units so long as there is a reasonable gap of at least 4 inches between them. Terrain. Imagine a real battlefield with its contours, morning mists and haze of dust. Picture the woods and hedges that obscure vision, the sudden fall of ground that hides enemy, and the distance that blur friend with foe. Towering above the miniature battlefield, we are aware of all that happens, but the troops represented by our models would not be so fortunate. You might expect that a more realistic way to play the game is double blind, with only the movement of troops being known to the GM until within the sight of their enemy. This is all well and good. However, we are then drawn into long affairs where multiple rooms are required to prevent cheating, and the GM will need to trot between and deliver messages and troop movements to each of the players, and soon this most social of situations has descended into a farce. No, we must leave realism at the door for the sake of our sanity. The regal double-blind game should be left to those in the military and the most hardcore of wargaming anoraks. I do, however, doff my flat cap to you if you are that dedicated to your craft. Back to terrain. Terrain, or scenery for some, can be anything from hills, large boulders, buildings, hedges, walls, woods, interposing units and elevated positions. Cover. Let's talk cover. Cover is what you really want when the proverbial really hits the fan. We have protection behind linear obstacles like hedges and walls, corners of buildings, woods, trenches, even in windows and doorways if we are to get properly into the spirit of things. Modifying the score needed to hit. As you might expect, it's easier to hit slow-moving, large targets, and all the harder to hit small, fast stuff. Handily, there is a table for that too. Resolving the effects of hits. And just because a missile hits, its target is not automatically slain. A man might be so lightly struck he suffers no immediate effects and can continue fighting. Very light wounds such as this are ignored in the game. Our warriors may be bruised, battered and bleeding from light cuts, but they are after all hardened fighters and indifferent to such inconvenience. In the case of larger creatures, they may be protected by tough hide, fur or layers of fat, which render them more capable of withstanding damage. We move on to the strength attributed to various weapons and the trusty damage chart, which is where the real technical stuff comes in. Suffice to say, you could feasibly play a game of Warhammer using the old adage that equal strengths versus toughness require 4s. +1 either way is +1 either way, so a strength of 5 versus a toughness of 4 is a 3. A strength of 3 versus a toughness of 4 is a 5. An additional point of strength or toughness either way, and you're into the realms of 2s and 6s. The saving throw. Troops wearing armour or carrying a shield are to some extent protected from the effects of damage. Missiles that would otherwise crush or pierce are deflected by armour or swept aside by a shield. To represent this, models protected in this way are allowed a saving throw. Once it has been established that a model has suffered damage, roll a d6. Use the charts below to find the minimum d6 score required for the armour to deflect or absorb the effect of the blow. Mounted troops. If a unit is mounted, they may enjoy certain benefits, as can be expected of those riding for their lord. Additional armour from barding and a faster pace to boot. Saving throw modifiers. Some weapons are better at penetrating armour than others. As such, some weapons modify the armour save appropriately. Reducing the effectiveness of the enemy's armour is a tried and true method of scything through their ranks, so long as you employ the right type of weapon. Saving throw modifiers can be seen here. Firing into close combat. Only the most foolhardy of generals will fire into a close combat involving his own men, although orcs and goblins are more than happy to do so. Casualty removal. Units of troops are usually considered to be identically armed and armoured throughout, with the exception of standard bearers, musicians and leaders. Shooting at individual models is not normally permitted, unless you are a pesky elf of course. Models being removed as casualties are taken as the owner sees fit, reducing ranks or files as appropriate to suit them. The only rule being that a rear rank may never be wider than the front rank. Hand-to-hand combat. This is what you're here for. None of that shooting gumph. You want hand-to-hand combat, and rightly so. All the best heroes of legend are mighty warriors. Who can think of a single archer who led their men to victory? No one, that's who. For all the intricacies of manoeuvre and missile fire, it is by hand-to-hand combat that most battles are resolved. If a player's best unit is thrown unsupported against the rampaging hordes, a heroic last stand is about all one could reasonably expect. Even rabble are deadly opponents, if approached without heed of their power. And yes, when I say rabble I do mean goblins. Whether your troops are the very flower of chivalry or the rank weeds of goblindom, good generalship begins with understanding their capabilities, exploiting their strengths and covering their weaknesses. This section provides everything we need to know for the cut and thrust of hand-to-hand combat. Charge. The charge is the most important aspect of melee. Without a proper devastating charge that has been soundly estimated, ably supported and well thought out, there can be no victory. Aligning the charge. To charge one's enemies, one must be orientated properly. It's no use charging off in the opposite direction expecting to get into the fray. Using a variety of set squares, a protractor and a pair of compasses, we can ascertain that the proper way to charge is perpendicularly like a pro. We could sit here all day talking about manoeuvring in a charge, oblique charges, charging in sight, charging in the sides and rear, receiving charges, and indeed failing to complete charges altogether. But that will take ages, and I don't have time for that. You want to get to the colour section sometime this year, don't you? Striking a blow. Once combatants have figured out where they are standing and what they are doing, it's time to have a good old-fashioned dust-up. And I don't mean that fight you had outside of Threshers with the homeless guy that tried to steal your six-pack of beer when you put it down to find your keys. No, sir. I mean hearty, smash-mouthed, blood-spilling chaos. We could talk about resolving combat, the order of attack, throw to hit, modifying scores to hit, throw to damage, saving throws and their modifiers, but once again, you want to get to the colour section, don't you? Casualty removal. In the case of missile fire, the chance fall of missiles slays random warriors, but the unit would regroup to maintain formation. Missile casualties are therefore removed from either the flanks or the rear rank as appropriate. In hand-to-hand combat there is an extra point to remember. As hand-to-hand combat involves two sides battling face to face, casualties occur only among those engaged in the combat, normally in the front rank. Models strike in their initiative order, so any killed before they have a chance to strike lose the opportunity to do so. Casualties should be removed from the fighting rank to ensure that those that can fight back can be counted and the appropriate dice rolled. Combat results. Once the combat round is over, the players and GM determine which side has won. Individual combat engagements are dealt with separately. To establish a victor, total up the amount of damage done by each side, including bonuses for charging, following up from the previous round, plus any rank bonus that may apply. The side that loses is pushed back by the enemy. Pushbacks are gradual, and it is assumed throughout the fighting, warriors don't turn their backs on their attackers as they move. They are simply edged backwards 2 inches. Follow-ups are when the winning side moves to maintain contact with their beaten foe. The bonus for following up is designed to ensure momentum gained from a successful combat result is maintained unless something truly heroic or fortunate occurs. Of course, there is always the option of routing your enemy. The downing of weapons and the fleeing of one's foes is truly a sight to behold, and the desired outcome of every combat. If the combat ends with both units still engaged, the combat will continue into the next turn. Units engaged in combat may not maneuver around whilst trying to fight. Routes, rallying and reforming. As we saw in the previous section, a unit losing a round of combat is pushed back. This is a dangerous moment for the retreating unit. Casualties may have been high and everything may look hopeless. In this situation, even the bravest of warriors might suddenly give up the fight. With some members of the unit running off in panic, remaining troops will find themselves in an even more hopeless position, so that they too are compelled to take the only sensible course of action and make a break for it. Once this occurs, unit cohesion is lost. The victors ride roughshod through their broken enemy and inflict untold casualties upon their stricken foe. The route test. Taken versus leadership. Everyone knows that. The unit's leadership value is taken against that of the leader. If they are a champion of note and have a higher leadership than the troops at their command, it may be used. If they're a simple sergeant that has risen through the ranks, they may very well have the same leadership value as their comrades. When a unit routs, it is immediately turned away from the enemy and moved away from them. The greatest loss of life in battle comes not during the actual fighting, but during the rout. As such, victors can inflict further damage upon their enemy whilst they flee. We can talk about routed units, leaving the table, panic and rallying a broken unit, but who really rallies broken units? That's not a thing, surely. Some units have fast and slow members. As such, all members of a unit are slowed to the speed of its slowest member. Unfortunately for them, they just shouldn't have routed in the first place. We then go into pursuers, losing combat, remaining in contact, close combat against pursuers, initiating close combat during a rout, not wishing to pursue, wishing to halt an ongoing pursuit if your troops are getting out of position and cannot catch their enemy, multiple combats, and finally reforming. Reserves. As any student of historic battles will tell you, troops spend a great deal of time hanging about and doing nothing. And then, all at once, they are committed to an engagement, and very soon they either win, lose, or become bogged down in a lengthy scrap. In most situations, only a very short space of time is spent actually fighting. However, bodies of troops not confronted directly by their enemy can move very quickly compared to those already engaged. We represent this by allowing troops to move again during the reserves phase of the turn. This has two effects in the game. Firstly, it allows us to simulate the bringing up of reserve bodies of troops. Secondly, it compresses the time units spend hanging around and enables us to get on with the battle in short order. The reserve move. A reserve move is made exactly like a normal move. Units can maneuver in exactly the same way. A unit brought to a halt because it fails a maneuver test for a simple maneuver in the movement phase may still move in the reserves phase. We then cover which units may move, what character models are up to, and the application of common sense. Psychology. A commander supervising a large body of troops cannot always rely on them to do exactly as he wants. His troops' sense of self-preservation, their fears and prejudices all affect their actions to an extent. This is simulated by the psychology rules. Psychology allows different troops to react in different ways under stressful or unusual circumstances. This ranges from outright fear to unquenchable hatred. These and other psychological effects are discussed in this section. Psychology tests. The description of each individual effect states when a test should be made. In general, however, all psychology tests are taken in the same way, as a test against the unit's cool. The unit's cool value is assumed to be that of its constituent troops, although the presence of a character model as the unit's leader will confer a bonus as explained in the character models section of the advanced rules. To take a test, the player must roll 2d6, aiming for equal or less than the unit's cool stat. If the score is more, then the test is failed. We then go into the various types of psychological manifestations: fear, frenzy, hatred, panic, and stupidity. It is worth noting that some units may have a leader with a different psychological profile to his troops. With this in mind, the leader is thus attributed the same psychology as his troops, and vice versa. Leaders. Every unit must be led by a leader of some description. The loss of one's leader is not necessarily catastrophic, but it is a hindrance all the same, reducing the capability to maneuver effectively and possibly losing the benefits of additional leadership and psychological traits. Leaders incur risk simply by being the linchpin around which the unit is formed. They are at risk when receiving missile fire and are similarly imperiled during close combat. In addition, they may challenge other unit leaders to personal combat. Leaders may challenge, refuse challenges, take up challenges, and be uncovered as the snivelling curs that they have turned out to be. Pfft, some leader they are. Should have chosen an orc to lead those goblins after all. Standards and musicians. A unit does not have to have standard bearers, drummers, horn blowers, or other musicians, but players may include them if they wish. Now I would hazard that Nigel Stillman would have a stern word with you if you turned up to a game without a fully realised front rank, resplendent with banners, musicians and naturally a leader too. Standards are used to give pre-arranged signals for advancing, halting and other manoeuvres, whereas a unit's musician can rally the troops to him with a blast of his horn. Models will of course be required to represent these prestigious gentlemen. If you don't have them, then it is suggested you either buy up a lovely metal command group or convert and customize your own from whatever spare bits you have lying around in your bits box. Standards may be captured if a unit is destroyed in battle. Needless to say, no unit likes to lose its standard, so a vicious fight will develop over its possession. Do not take a standard route test, but fight another round of hand-to-hand combat immediately. Place the standard bearer model aside to indicate it is being fought over. If the side attempting to capture the standard wins the round, then they do so. If the side attempting to recapture their standard wins, then it is recovered to safety. If the result is a draw, the standard remains where it falls, becomes trampled into the ground, and is recovered by the winning side at the end of the battle. If a unit's standard bearer is slain and the unit is pushed back, but the enemy player decides not to try and capture the standard, it is left in the dirt to be recovered by the winning side at the end of the battle. Once a standard has been captured, the player is entitled to take the model carrying it from his opponent. This model is then placed amongst the victorious unit, and one of its own models is removed to compensate. Where models are very different in nature, a simple piece of paper with a rough sketch of the banner could be placed in the unit instead. If a unit standard is captured, its leadership characteristic drops by 2 for the remainder of the game. Similarly, if the unit's standard is lost but not captured, its leadership characteristic is reduced by only 1. But why capture standards at all? Other than really annoying your enemy, you may wish to build a new miniature bearing the captured standard for use in further games to really put it up your opponents. Not only this, but captured standards add to your victory points at the end of the game. A standard may be recaptured in the same way as it was lost. Musicians are less flamboyant than standard bearers, simply making it easier to maneuver units with a +1 modifier to the unit's leadership value. Although this bonus may not take the unit's base leadership over 10. Routed units lose their musicians and standards, preferring to drop everything than to be weighted down with bulky items. Any standards that are dropped during a rout remain there until the end of the battle, whereupon they may be claimed by the victor. To summarise, the Warhammer Fantasy Battle basic rules are chock full of common sense application, a few easy to learn tables, and a whole lot more too. I hope the GM isn't doing too much up to this point, except perhaps administering psychology tests and recording the results. It is when we get into the advanced rules in the next video that things really start to heat up. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did researching and rereading my battered old copy of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Anyways, thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.